very special day for us. We've been working our way toward this day for about 5 years now. And over the last 5 years, the things that have happened include getting the property on the National Register of Historic Sites. That was about a 3-year venture. That is, it took 3 years from start to, we didn't work steadily on it for 3 years, but by the time you go through the process, it took 3 years to get to the end. Once that application was in process, we went to work on the next step, which was to get an assessment of the property. If you've not been in the school before, you probably wouldn't notice most of the things that have happened in the last 6 months, but they include a new ceiling. That was one of the big problems with the building at that point. By 2014, the ceiling was in the process of slowly coming down. It was an old lathing and horsehair plaster ceiling. It was sagging in the middle, as it turns out, by about 3 inches. And the plaster was cracking. Portions of it were falling to the ground. And if we didn't do anything in another few years, it would have all been on the ground. Gravity is very persistent about things like that. So we have a new ceiling in here. That involves some removing the old ceiling, some structural work to strengthen the supports for the ceiling, and then putting in a new ceiling that is not historically authentic in the sense that we built it the same way the old one. We didn't do lathing and horsehair plaster. You can still find people who would do that. It costs a lot of money, and you probably wouldn't actually know the difference when you were done. What was done here was to use modern building material, blue board, and then put a plaster coat over it and then paint it. That took a bit. But that was done, and then once that was done, the interior was painted and the exterior trim. Structurally, however, the biggest thing we did is nearly invisible. The foundation in this corner of the building had been slowly sinking. It's got a masonry exterior. As the foundation sunk, the bricks separated, the mortar gave way. Some of the bricks, of course, got old. So the first thing to do was to stabilize the foundation. That was done. And then we were able to replace and repair the mortar and the bricks. That involved a certain amount of time finding bricks that would match. But that was done. And the mortar also had to match. And we took out some mortar that had been put in some years ago that for some reason was red, which wasn't very authentic. So those are the big things that were done: the foundation, the masonry, the ceiling, and the painting, interior, and the trim. But it puts us in a position where the building now is stable. And we can now move forward with other things that, with a little bit of luck, will enable us to finally get the building open on a continuing basis to the public, which is our goal. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So all this took about 5 years, involved getting a conditions assessment of the property from a qualified team. Then they gave us a very clear diagnosis of what needed to be done, and suggestions as to in what order it should be done, and some ideas about how much it would probably cost. Their initial guesstimate was just under $250,000. That's a little scary because when this building was built, it cost $1,291. And in 1912, when the association, which had recently purchased it, did some repair work, including putting in this floor, they spent $100. So times have changed. A little bit about the building. It's the oldest public building in Ayer. It's 2 years older than Ayer. It was constructed by the town of Groton in 1869. Ayer separated from Groton in February of 1871, and at that time acquired 2 schools from Groton. This was one of them. This was the District 11 school in Groton. Groton at that time had 16 district schools, 16 single-room schoolhouses, a neighborhood school concept. Ayer got 2 of those. The other one is gone. Sandy Pond School is still here. It's here in part, entirely really, because of our predecessors who decided to save it in 1908. It was closed as a school in 1906. We'll talk a little bit about why that happened. When it did, a group of neighbors and community residents got together, bought the building for $1 from the town of Ayer on the condition that they would maintain it, which they did. And then they were allowed to use it for public events, although they cannot charge admission. They could ask for donations, though, which is what we do. And they maintained it and repaired it and improved it to some extent over a long period of time, and that's why the building is still here. And we can thank them for the foresight. The association that they created in 1908 is now over 110 years old, and I'm the current president, so I am the beneficiary of all of these years of other people's labor that gave us this property to continue. By 2014, we realized we needed to do something, and we set out to do it, and we have now made progress towards this long-term goal of getting the building into the kind of shape it needs to be in to be used continuously as a public facility. I should add that this building is not the first building on this site. There were at least 3 previous schoolhouses. The first in 1792. So this has been the site of a school for a long time. This is the last of the schools that were built. Its immediate predecessor. All the predecessors were wooden. At least one of them burned down. The last one did not burn down, although it's pretty clear that by the time it didn't burn down, the town of Groton was ready to burn it. In fact, the Groton Town Committee went to the town of Groton 4 years in a row with a request to replace the then existing building. 3 years they were turned down. When they went in the 4th time, they said, we really have to have a new building. The present one is not fit for animals, let alone children. And that apparently did it and got them $1,200 to build a new school, and that's how it got erected in the first place. But it is the 4th building on this particular site. Interesting things about this building. When I walk into a building that's a National Historic Site, I tend to think old building. Sort of like some people look at me and think old. My youngest grandson said to me last week, I was asking him if he knew that Grandpa was old. He said, yes. I said, how old do you think Grandpa is? And he said, 6. When you're 3.5, 6 is old. Yes, it's an old building in the sense it's been here for 150 years. But if you had come to this building in 1869 or 1870 as a new teacher or student, you wouldn't have thought old. You would have thought new. You would have thought modern. Why would you have thought that? Well, some of the indicators, notice the windows. There's actually a lot of them. They're quite large. They let in a lot of light. This room is light. Light colors. The upper part of the wall and the ceiling are very light. The whole idea was to create a well-illuminated space that would be easier for students to work in and to learn in and for the teacher to work with. It's a high ceiling. Some of the earlier buildings we know were sort of here. It's bigger than its predecessors. It may not look like a very big room to us. It's 25 by 25, basically. But compared to its predecessors, it's large. This school never had more than 30 students. We've got 25 chairs in here today. And it was able to handle the students that it had without crowding everybody in. So it was bigger. It was better designed. It would have seemed new and modern in 1869. At the same time, it was a little behind the times in the sense that by 1869, school systems were moving away from single-room schools, which are, in our terminology, they're kind of a neighborhood school. The kids who came here were all from the neighborhood, but they were in different grades. And one teacher had to handle all these kids in different grades. School systems by the 1860s were slowly moving towards the kind of school system we're familiar with, a leveled or graded situation in which you have like grades 1 is in this classroom, grade 2 is in that classroom, et cetera. And each teacher only has to deal with one level of students. Teachers here had to deal with all levels initially. And it was a hard job, but they actually did it pretty well. So this school, in being a single-room schoolhouse, was a little behind the times. The town of Groton was already moving to a level school system. They had actually started in 1860 with the high school. The Civil War came along, nothing happened for about 5 years. It was 5 years before the school committee came to the town with a first request to do anything for the school system, and that was a request to build a new one here. And as I said, it took 4 years to get that approved. But Groton was moving slowly towards a level school system. And that became an issue in the separation of Ayer from Groton. And it became an issue because in this particular district, the school district, it meant for the parents of the children here, in particular the smaller children, they were going to have to be sending, instead of sending their kids to a neighborhood school, they were going to be sending them 4 miles to downtown Groton. Well, there weren't any automobiles. There were no train lines that ran from here to Groton. Well, that's not quite true. You could go to downtown Ayer and then take a train up to Groton Station. But from here to downtown Ayer and then up, that was not a simple trip. So parents here were not keen on this move on Groton's part, and that was one of the factors that led to the separation of the two towns and the creation of Ayer, which prior to being Ayer was known as Groton Junction because of the railroads, and the railroads are another whole story. Yes.
What was the other thing that led to it?
Well, I'm told there were several others. One of them seems to have been demographic. The population here in Groton Junction, with the arrival of the railroads, had really increased greatly. And by 1871, there were more people living here in Groton Junction than there were in the whole rest of Groton put together. And they wanted their own town. They just sort of felt like they deserved their own town. And so that was a factor. And then I think there were some other issues too. There might have been, with the railroad, it brought a lot of workers who were immigrants, a lot of Irish for one thing, at a time when that was not necessarily a great thing in this country. And those, so as compared to the rest of Groton, which tended to be more agricultural and sort of older New England kind of thing. So there were just tensions, and the educational system was one of them.
And to my knowledge, there was a little bit more where the citizens of Groton Junction thought they deserved more representation in the town's government than they were actually getting. And so they also wanted, they were also concerned that they had to go so far to town meeting, and they wanted sort of like a secondary town hall built in Groton Junction in addition to a secondary high school being built down here.
Yeah. So there were budgetary issues as well as everything else. Yeah. It's funny that money would be a factor in these things. Very surprising. So, as I say, it was a little behind the times in terms of being a single-room schoolhouse, and when it was built, I'm pretty confident that nobody, including the workmen who built it, was thinking 150 years in terms of the lifespan of the building. But here it is. Ayer, we've already mentioned, as the origins of Ayer, said a little bit about that. The building that we're standing in now, my first impression of it when I first saw it, which was I think sometime in 2013, I walked in and I said, wow, it's an old school classroom. And it does look like an old school classroom, but for more years of its life than it was a classroom, it wasn't a classroom. It was basically a public event space. It was owned by the Sandy Pond School Association, who initially acquired it with the intent that they would use it for class reunions. Most of the early members had gone to the school, or they had family who'd gone to the school, or they had family who'd taught at the school. And so initially their thought was, let's preserve this as a place to have reunions and class get-togethers, and that was the very first thing they did. They actually had a big reunion here in June of 1908 before they even owned the building, and then on the basis of that, they said, hey, we want to buy it, and the town eventually said yes. In the following years, it continued to be used for reunions, but it slowly became a more community larger community event space where things were done, things that happened here included lectures. We've had a couple lectures here today, first time in a long time. There were lectures, there were dinner dances. Those were very popular. And the only thing that the association did to the building physically was to put in that little platform so they could have a piano. And in the course of that, they closed off one of the two entrances. There were originally two entrances. There's one over here and one over there. Those were separate entrances. They were identical. One was for the boys and one was for the girls, because you wouldn't want boys and girls coming into the building together. You never know what could happen. The funny part was once they got in the classroom, they sorted themselves by grade and boys sat right next to girls. But we did prevent things happening when they were coming in.
Is there a source of heat right now today in the building?
There is not. There is not at this time. That, you're sitting in front of what was the source of heat, that stove. That is not currently connected. Where one of the things we are looking at is how to put heat in the building, but there isn't any right now. And there wasn't when they were using it for these community events. But as I said, they had dinner dances were big, and they did do some stuff for that. They put in the piano for the dance part. They took the desks out, put them up in the attic, which is where we found the ones we have. They built 3 very large folding wooden tables. They're 8 feet each, and they're behind those benches over there. They added this L, which has a kitchen. It also has a washroom now. Originally it had the extension of an outhouse. But they put in a cooking stove, they put in a sink, they put in plumbing. They didn't put in any electricity till the 1920s. They could have done it earlier. There was an electric utility in Ayer, I think as early as 1889, I believe. Didn't get around to it. So they added the L and put that entrance in, and the L was set up so they could prepare a meal out in the L. They put in that Dutch door that connects the L and the classroom, so you could have the lower door closed and have a pass-through. You'd take the tables out, you'd set them up. There's about 24 folding wooden chairs. They're currently in the storage unit, but they've been stored in here. You could bring the chairs in and the tables up. You could have a dinner. At the end of the dinner, take the dishes, rush them off to the kitchen to get cleaned, put the tables away, put the chairs out of the way. Somebody goes to the piano, and you have a dinner dance. Very popular event, quite a few of those. And one of the artifacts from that era, aside from the piano, are 2 signs. One of them is up, and the other one is currently in storage. And they warn people attending these functions that all objectionable dancing is prohibited. And I'm guessing that they knew what they meant by by objectionable. I'm not sure I know exactly what it would have been. I'd have been very circumspect under those circumstances. So they had dinner dances, they had public events, they had at least one art auction here. And it continued in that mode on into the 50s or so with open houses, and the open houses continued after a while, but got down to about 1 a year, and the building was slowly deteriorating. And then there were a couple years when it sort of wasn't open at all. We are on the upswing, but our long-term goal is to be able to use the building in the way that it was used for all those years. It was really used that way for more years as a community center than it was as a classroom, and yet has the beauty of preserving the classroom space so you can see how the classroom looked and how it worked. So anyway, students who came here had a different experience than students who go to schools today. There were some obvious differences. The desks and chairs bolted to the floor. There are inkwells in the desks, but there are also, in most of them, a slate. And that is because that is where most of the assignments were done. The way a teacher in a classroom like that would operate would be to small groups. You take a small group that are the first graders, you come sit down with them, you give them, you talk to them, give them some kind of instruction, you give them an assignment. You move on to group 2. The kids have the assignment, they've got their slates, they write out the assignment, whatever it is they're being asked to do. The teacher goes around the room and eventually comes back to group 1. and looks at their slates and tells them, you did really well, or, that's not so good. Explains everything. Then they erase the slates. Teacher gives them another assignment, and the day would proceed in that fashion. So a teacher who taught in that kind of a setting had to be really diligent and had to be pretty flexible, because you're dealing with first graders, seventh graders, eighth graders. And Don Parker, who gave a talk earlier today, gave us some examples of the questions that eighth graders would be asked on an exam. And I think of the questions that he asked, probably had the room of people, including me, been graded on our answers to those questions, we would have all flunked. They really were. The instruction was a lot of rote and a lot of memorization, but it was very demanding. Kids were really being taught a lot. Reading, writing, and not just reading, writing, and arithmetic, but history, government, science, the physical sciences. And they were being expected to retain knowledge that I think, in my case, most of the time, if somebody asks me about those things, I say, well, okay, I'll be right back to you. Let me check my iPhone. But there was no iPhone. So the kids came to school. The school day usually started around 8:45 or so. There were some rituals to the day. There would have been the Pledge of Allegiance. There would have been, in some cases, I guess the Lord's Prayer might have been recited. The older students would be asked to help with things. They would be asked to get the stove up running and keep it running during the day. There was a well outside. Older students would go outside and fill the big bucket of water and bring it in, and that would be used by all the students during the course of the day. They would have a dipper that they would put in to drink water. If the weather was inclement, and in New England, inclement can mean snow, the students would be asked to help with that. Some of the students, most of the students at that time, probably came from agricultural backgrounds, and they might be very familiar with using something like this, which is a hay rake. I'm familiar with that because I grew up baling hay with my dad a while ago. The teacher's job, of course, was not just to instruct, but to keep order in a class consisting of kids of very different ages and with a high amount of energy. They did get a couple of breaks during the day. They got lunchtime. They would have brought their own lunches. That would have been necessary, and typically some kind of sandwich wrapped in a cloth, maybe a piece of fruit. And they would also typically have walked to school. There weren't too many choices at that time. So they would get an hour at lunch. That was called nooning. They would get a couple breaks during the day, somewhere in the afternoon, 3 o'clock or so. They would all be dismissed, and they'd come back and do it again the next day, unless it was a weekend. Typically, in those days, this is not the bell that was used. We have another bell that was probably used. That one's very loud. With the Pledge of Allegiance, one of the things that would happen would be one student, and this would be a mark of favor. If you were asked to do things like hold the flag out while the class recited the Pledge of Allegiance, that was a good thing. You were being rewarded for being a good student. If you were not a good student, you probably wouldn't be asked to do that, and you might even end up having to be punished. There isn't much talk about that in the literature I've seen, but we are all familiar with the sort of stereotypical punishment, which was sitting on a stool with a dunce cap. A friend of mine, Noreen Kiff, is in the back and has been the co-curator at the Little Red Schoolhouse in North Attleboro for years, which has a student visitation program, tells me that they do have a stool and a dunce cap, but that doesn't work for punishment because the kids compete to get it. But that was then. This is now. Generally speaking, the kids at Sandy Pond School obviously had to spend a lot of time during the day. They were being pretty closely supervised. They got report cards. We have a couple of sample report cards. They're not out on display right now because when we did the work on the interior of the classroom this summer, everything that was in this classroom went into the big storage container outside, and some of it is still there, including report cards and a lot of photographs. I say that to correct a misimpression that someone had. Someone recently asked about what we were keeping in that large storage unit, and the former president of our association said, "Our money," which would be really funny if you saw our checking account. You could hold it in a very small container. Students who attended Sandy Pond School, a lot of them come from farm families, not all of them. And what that meant for their school year was that sometimes during the fall harvest, they would not go to school for a while because they'd have to help with the harvesting. Okay, the school closed in 1906. Why? Well, the short answer is the streetcar. What happened after Ayer acquired the school and began using it as a school was that Ayer, despite initially not having been happy with the idea of a centralized school system, Ayer in fairly short order began to centralize its own school system. And not too long after Sandy Pond School became part of Ayer, the town of Ayer started wanting to close it down and have the kids go downtown. And I ran into the same objection from parents to that proposal that Groton had run into when Groton proposed it. It wasn't quite as far to downtown Ayer, but it was still a ways, and particularly the parents of the younger children were not pleased with this idea. It was possible for children in this area to get on the train at Willow Street Junction Station, which is right over there. The railroad is still there, but there isn't a stop there anymore. But you could get on the train there and ride to downtown Ayer and get off. The problem with that was the schedule really was kind of not wonderful for small children. It typically would have meant leaving home at 6 or 7 in the morning and getting home late in the day. And the parents of small children, again, objected. There was a compromise, and after a fashion, this school became 1 through 8 and then 1 through 6, I believe. And it continued to function until 1906. In 1906, the Fitchburg and Lowell street railway system put in a route, a track that went right behind the school. That little stub of a road there that used to be part of Westford Road where all the cars are parked today, that was a streetcar line. Once that went in, then that made it possible for kids here to get on the streetcar and very inexpensively and frequently go downtown and come back. And so then the parents said, okay, we'll go with that. And so the school closed in 1906. And in the normal course of events, what usually happens to old schools that have been closed by towns, and particularly single-room schools, they typically went away. And this one would have gone away had it not been for this neighborhood association that decided they wanted to preserve it and set out to do it. So we can thank our progressive-minded predecessors for having preserved this building and given it to us. And it's kind of a miracle in a way, I think. That was my first impression when I came through it. For the first time, I thought, wow, I just can't believe this is still here. So as a member of the current version of the association, that's our goal, is to ensure that hopefully 150 years from now, when I don't expect to be here, the building still will be. And what we want to have happen to it now, we still have some work to do. There are other things that need to be done, but it's now kind of, if you will, stabilized. Structurally, it's going to be here for a while now. The ceiling isn't going to come down again for a while. The foundation is no longer moving. The masonry has been repaired. That couldn't be done until the foundation stopped moving. And we're ready to move on to what we hope will be a future in which this building can function in much the way that it did for many years from 1908 on into the 50s or so is basically a community event space. We think it's really got a lot of potential for that. And in the meantime, we also, at the same time, it's also an iconic image or a symbol of early education here in Massachusetts. And the fact that here in Massachusetts, we were early in the public education arena, educating, building educational buildings, valuing schooling. It was happening here from a very early time in the history of this country. And this building is here again, in part as an artifact of that.